Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 307 of the Medieval Podcast. I'm your host, Danièle Cybulskie. Everybody loves a good whodunit, sifting through clues and witness testimony, trying to find the truth at the heart of a murder mystery. So it's not surprising that some of the most beloved fictional medieval characters are those who are thrust into detective work. But the question is, how did real medieval people investigate crimes? What did they look for? And how did they decide if a person's death was an unfortunate accident or foul play? This week, I spoke with Dr. Sara Butler about forensic medicine and death investigation in the medieval world. Sara is professor and King George III Chair in British History, as well as being the director of the Center for Historical Research at Ohio State University. She's also the author of several books, including Divorce in Medieval England, From One to Two Persons at Law, The Language of Abuse, Marital Violence in Later Medieval England, and, most recently, Pain, Penance, and Protest, Peine Forte et Dure in Medieval England. Today, though, we're looking at one of Sara's earlier works, Forensic Medicine and Death Investigation in Medieval England. Our conversation on how death investigation was conducted, who was involved, and how we know about medieval forensics is coming up right after this. Well, thank you, Sara, for being on the podcast. I've wanted to talk to you about this book for ages, and here we are. We're finally making it work. It's so nice to meet you. Welcome.
Well, and I'm absolutely delighted to be here and as well to finally have a chance to meet you.
Yeah, I mean, we are vibing already. People can't see you, but your lipstick is on point today, just so they know.
I try hard.
We have a professional in the studio today. So we're going to be talking about forensics. We're going to be talking about the process of investigating death. So we need to start at the beginning with the coroner. So who is this guy? How do they get the job? What is the job?
Okay, so I think it's important to note that the coroner in the Middle Ages is not a medical practitioner. Coroner is also not a lawyer. These are sort of the images that we get, I think, when we watch TV. Really, the coroner is just a rich guy. And that's what makes him qualified for the job, because he can afford to do it. He has the time and he has the money to travel. And he's either appointed or elected, sort of depending on where he is coming from and whether or not he's a county coroner, or if he is a coroner for a specific borough or a liberty or something along those lines. These are, sort of independent jurisdictions within England. Basically, his job is to go out there and deal with any sudden or unexpected, unnatural deaths and figure out what happened. And he's best qualified to do it because he doesn't really have anything else going on in his life.
So if we're really old school and we're picturing like Quincy MD, who's got people in his office, he's putting them on a table because he's a doctor. We're not talking about the same thing. We're talking about a guy whose job is completely different and does have some detective work involved, which I'm super excited to get into. But one of the distinctions that you make that's really important in the book is a coroner is not the same as a sheriff. So tell us who the sheriff is.
Okay, so one really big difference here. So sheriffs, first of all, after like the 1270 inquest of sheriffs, the position of sheriff becomes a yearly appointment because the sheriffs are so important in the shire, the county, that everybody is worried about them being corrupt. So one of the ways to prevent that is by saying, okay, it's a year appointment. So how much damage can you do in a year? And I think that is something that really helps because the sheriff is the guy who is the most important king's official in the county. His job, from what I can tell, his job is to sit there every day with a basket of writs from the king, opening each one of them up and then telling his bailiffs to head out and do these things that he needs to do. He spends a lot of time assembling inquests, which is, just basically finding juries to take care of problems. But but it's a busy job. So the coroner in some ways was kind of created as a bit of a check on the sheriff, but the sheriff is also supposed to be a check on the coroner. I mean, I'm sort of assuming the two were probably good buddies a lot of the time because they had to do a lot of work together. And you don't find too many situations where, coroners are ratting out sheriffs or vice versa. So they had to find a way to work together. But they end up being two quite different positions, in part because the sheriff is there for a year at a time. And you find people are often sheriffs successively in different counties, and they will go back and be a sheriff multiple times in the same county. So sometimes it's, people do that a bit, but often coroners are former sheriffs. So they know what's going on. The coronership, though, it's a life appointment. So I think what most people are doing is they're doing different offices out there, coroner, bailiff, constable, things like this, or sorry, sheriff, bailiff, constable, in the hopes that eventually they'll get that plum position of a coroner, and then they can just do that until they die. But yeah, it requires a lot of working together, I think. And it's the same group of men who are filling these positions generally.
Yes, well, and it's important to figure out how they get to have the knowledge to do these jobs because, as you say, they're not medical practitioners. Coroners are not medical practitioners. They're also not lawyers. So how do they learn how to do the job?
Yeah. You learn it by being in one of those families that's constantly working in the fields. I kind of think of this as sort of like a medieval blue bloods.
Hmm.
Oh, dad's a coroner. Oh, my brother is a sheriff. Uncle Joe has been working as a bailiff for the last couple of years. You're in one of those families that does this work. So you know what happens. You know what's going on. It does seem to be the same families who dominate over and over in these positions.
Right. And there's one more aspect that I think we need to clarify before we get to the fun stuff, and that is it's also a position that deals with finances. So one of the lines that you have in the book is that death, what did you say? Like, death is highly profitable for the king. So what does this mean?
It is. And actually, that's one of the things that I was most surprised by when I first entered this field. I remember actually in the first year of my PhD, my doctoral advisor, Cynthia Neville, saying something to me about, the profits of justice. And I was like, whoa, 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 hold on. Justice is not supposed to be profitable. And she said, oh, that is such a modern way of thinking.
Hmm.
And it is really important to look at things that way. So I will say that a lot of justice in this period, I don't think is actually all that profitable, but criminal justice sure was. It was one of those areas where the king made away like a bandit, which, there's a real irony to that. Yeah. So, I mean, the king could make a lot of money off of death in particular, because if somebody is dead and another person is responsible for it, then that other person is going to be considered a felon and have all of their goods, both landed property and movables, confiscated to the king. And I realize that often we end up with felons who don't own that much. But some did own a lot, and that was useful. But on top of that, accidental deaths are also another situation where the king made money. Because if a person is run over by a cart, for example, well, there's always a possibility that the cart and all of its goods, whatever it was holding, might actually be confiscated to the king. Now, a lot of people will sit back and say it should only be the part of the cart that moves, i.e., that should be held responsible as a murderer. So maybe the cart wheels, but we find quite a few situations where everything is confiscated. On top of that, there are a lot of procedural faults we discover that end up leading to the fining of communities that also make the king money. This is, somebody forgot to raise the hue and cry. The four nearest villas close to the person where that person died, they're supposed to show up for the coroner's inquest. If they don't, or if just even one of them forgets, they're going to get fined. It's all of these tiny little fines out there that add up. So really, it ends up being very profitable for the king.
Right. And so one of the points that you really, really stress in the book is that this does not mean that the coroner is corrupt. Yeah. It means that what he's trying to record, the purpose of the job is different than what it might be today, right?
And this really shapes the records, which I think is one of the most important points, particularly when you compare these records to what's going on the continent. Like on the continent, when you have a death, sometimes the records, you can have 50 folios about it with all these witness depositions and stuff like that. But it's a different system there, and the records serve a different purpose. The coroner's rolls, they're really about the king wanting to know, hey, where's my money? What's going on with it? I mean, often there is way more when it comes to an inventory of the possessions of the accused than anything else. Like none of the investigative process is there. So when you're the historian who's using these records, you spend a lot of time sort of looking between the lines to try and figure out what actually happened. And yes, it is important not to think, oh, the coroner only cares about money. It's the records.
Hmm.
It's not the coroner.
Yes. And I mean, what does he need to write down if it's all already in his head? He's already got that. He just needs something that's going to prompt him to remember the details if he's asked about it later, right?
Exactly. And that's the thing. I mean, he's going to be at the trial. It's a part of his job.
Hmm.
So really the record is, okay, quick little mnemonic device. What happened? Oh yeah, I remember that one. So
Yeah.
it's not that important to have everything down on paper. It's really hard for us sometimes to look back at it because, again, we have expectations that are not being met. But I think we have to remember they're not us. And that's okay.
Yes, they're not us. And while we've spent a bunch of time shaping this, I think it's so important that we do that because when we go through the procedure, we need to remember that they're not us. So, yeah, we needed to set this up first.
Mhm.
Okay, so let's get into the fun stuff. I'm just like a farmer in a field and I'm walking out to my field and I find a body. What do I do?
Well, you scream. I mean, that's required by law. It's called the hue and cry. You have to run and scream, but run and scream with purpose.
Hmm.
You are alerting all of your neighbors, and your neighbors, once they hear the hue and cry, they're expected to come out and join that procession. The point is, you are alerting the authorities and the four nearest villes because you want everybody to know that a murder has taken place because for all you know, the murderer might still be in the area. And this whole running around and screaming might flush the person out. There's also, everybody's supposed to join. Hey, when you look back later and start thinking, is there anyone who didn't join the hue and cry? That's a great opportunity to think, could there be a reason? Is that person the murderer? I mean, there's a lot going on with this process. It's about alerting people, disseminating the news so everybody knows and everybody knows quickly. But it's also, hey, something terrible has happened. Start thinking, is there anybody you know who might be responsible? Was there any suspicious behavior going on?
Yes. And I mean, it does a bunch of things like it establishes the time when this body was found. And we have to remember there's no police force. So if you raise the hue and cry and somebody is running away, they can be apprehended. They might not otherwise be. So, yeah, this is a very important part of the process.
It is. It definitely is. And then, hopefully through this whole process, the word will be sent out to the coroner, and the coroner hopefully will get there quickly. Now, there are four coroners for every county. Sometimes they work alone, sometimes they work in pairs. The goal is to get them there as quickly as possible. It isn't always possible for them to be there quickly. Sometimes it takes a little bit of time. The one important point, though, is there has to be, I mean, I use the term scene integrity because that's the term that gets used today. It's not a medieval term, but it's clearly what they were striving for. Don't touch the body. You want that body left in place because they want to examine the body. I mean, the body is definitely going to be undressed before they get there because they need to see the body naked, but it would be nice to keep that body without any, further bruising or anything happening to it afterwards as a result of mismanagement. So they have to guard the body until the coroner gets there.
That's right. And it's not exactly don't move it. As you're saying, why would they have to remove the clothes from the body, maybe even before the coroner gets there?
Yeah. So clothing in this period is really expensive. People don't own that many clothes. And because of this, clothing actually ends up having value and is used for paying taxes. This is something we don't think about. It is clear that in some areas, the clothes were actually used to pay the coroner, which I still think is just weird and wonderful. But if not, they were going to end up being used to pay your local priest who's going to perform the burial. So it's a form of payment more than anything else. And, you have to make sure that those clothes then aren't going to be stolen. So I think that the family would probably want to remove the clothes just to secure them and make sure that nothing happens before they're needed.
Yes. Well, and there's another reason that you need to touch the body, and that is to establish, are they really dead? Because this is not super easy.
It isn't super easy. I know that when you read like treatises in this period, they do talk about pulse and things like that. But I'm sure if you've ever tried to take somebody else's pulse before, sometimes it can be kind of hard. And, if a person isn't breathing all that well, etc., it can be really difficult. Now, they do have the idea of putting things in front of a person's lips to see if any wind is coming out. And that seems to be the major priority. But on top of that, I think they're probably also going to look at the body and see, do we have any wounds that look like mortal wounds? Just to
Mhm.
make sure this guy's really dead, right?
Yes, because there are times when it is hard to tell. They don't have a mirror to put
Mhm.
against the face. They might have a thread. That might work, but without, and you say in the book, without a stethoscope, you might not be able to tell if the heart's beating. Like it's a lot harder to tell than we might imagine.
Well, and if you ever read miracle stories from this period, the number of people who are miraculously returned to life after prayers to a saint suggests to me that they really weren't very good at this. Sorry, not to destroy people's faith here, but I think some of those people just may not have been dead.
Yes. Well, I mean, I love it. We can call it a miracle and maybe a mistake at the same time. They don't have to be mutually exclusive, right?
Exactly.
All right. So the coroner shows up. What's the first thing that they do? What do they start doing?
Well, I think even before the coroner gets there, a coroner works with the jury. And the jury was probably assembled and ready and waiting by the time the coroner arrived. Now, they're not supposed to get to work until the coroner shows up, but it seems pretty clear that once the coroner is there, they're already there. They have been chosen from the locality and they already have been talking to people and have some good ideas of what's going on. So the coroner's inquest, they're a funny group in a lot of ways. This is definitely a group of jurors, but not jurors in the way we see jurors in the modern era. Today, we have this idea that jurors should be impartial and have, evidence fed to them. That is not at all the idea of a jury in the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, jurors were supposed to be witnesses of sorts, not eyewitnesses, but, the idea that because they are from the area, they know what's going on because they know the people, they can talk to the people. It seems like too often these jurors are people who might be from the same profession as the person who died. So, not necessarily family or friends, but, colleagues of sorts. It also seems clear that sometimes they would put people whose knowledge they needed on these jurors. And spending a lot of time looking over jury list, it became clear to me that there are some folks who seem to make it on there a little bit more often than others. Barbers, in particular, seem to make it on there when they needed a medical opinion. Now, again, I know we don't necessarily think of barbers as being medical professionals. They had the knives,
Mm-hmm.
which meant they had everything you needed, not only to cut your hair, but to perform a little bit of surgery. Barbers were usually people who knew all about anatomy, and they were more plentiful than a lot of the other medical professionals out there. Doctors and university trained surgeons, there are very few of them in England at all. England didn't even have the schools to train them for that. You had to get training on the continent. And when we did have physicians, quite frankly, they usually were foreigners who were working for rich people. Regular people went to their moms for medicine, or if things got really dire, to a barber or to a pharmacist or someone, an apothecary, someone like that out there. But it does seem like in really difficult situations, they might need to call in someone like that. But these are the people then who are going to sit on the jury, and they are going to help the coroner with the investigation. The coroner's in charge, but the coroner's also an outsider. So he's sort of relying on their inside knowledge to get the job done. And the inquest, every male over the age of 14 in that area and the 4 closest villes are supposed to show up to the inquest. And it seems clear that a lot of the inquest is about asking questions. They'll divide people up into, groups that would be not necessarily intimidating. So don't put the rich people and the poor people together. That's not a good idea. Keep people the same level of society altogether, so they're not going to feel that they can't answer honestly. So there's a lot of questioning being asked, but then they're also going to look at the scene of the crime. When you look at something like Bracton, the legal treatise from the 13th century, it says, look around for horse prints, cart tracks, see if there's a trail of blood, ask people if they have any idea what happened, and then start tracking down that person, their whereabouts. Where were they the night before? Whose home did they stay at? Are there any known associates? They also want to ask about that person's family history. Now, part of that is determining that that person is actually English, because if we go back far enough and could say that person was Norman, then there was a fine that was due. But I think a big part then is also figuring out, who is this person? Can we find their family? What can you tell us about them? Do you know honestly where they are right now? So a lot of questioning is going on. They're also looking at the scene. And then finally, they're looking to the body as well.
Well, I love that. Well, this entire book, but you have this part about looking at the actual scene of the crime, because I think that because the legal system is different, people today might imagine that nobody cared about forensic, nobody cared about the crime scene. They found a body and they're like, oh, well, let's bury it. But this is not what happened.
Yeah. So, the body, they're not doing autopsies. But the one thing that I always like to point out to people, we watch way too much TV. And on TV, they're doing autopsies left, right, and center. But autopsies are expensive. They don't do that many autopsies today either. And quite frankly, sometimes when looking at a body, you don't really need to do an autopsy because you know what killed them.
Mm-hmm.
There's an axe sticking out of your chest. We can be pretty darn sure it was the axe that killed you. So, autopsies aren't always necessary. But this is it. They are looking at the bodies. The body is naked. They roll it over to make sure that they're looking at all parts of the body so that they can see if there are any sort of smaller wounds that may be important. They have to figure out which one was the mortal wound. So which one actually killed you, which means, so they're looking at, the width, the depth of the wounds. They want to measure all of this so that they can put it up against a weapon if they find a bloody weapon somewhere. But they also want to get a good sense of, does it look like this was enough to kill a person? That's also really important in those instances where, there was an assault and then a person died maybe a couple of days later, trying to figure out, could that assault have killed them? Or did the person maybe just catch a flu or something and die because of that? So, they're looking at a lot of things on those fronts. Bracton, again, when you go back to Bracton says, look for strangulation marks around the neck. There's another good coroner's manual out there that suggests if a body was found in the water, sit on the chest and see if it expels any water. I think that these are a lot of things that we're just assuming they're not really doing, because if they're not doing autopsies, they're not doing anything. But that's absolutely not the case. They're not doing autopsies. And I kind of think actually the reason there has something to do with what Katie Parks has argued, which is that up north in Europe, they're convinced that it takes about a year for the soul to leave the body. So you don't want to mess with the body because you might be endangering the soul. I actually see that as something that fits in well with a lot of the Revenant stories that sort of pop up. So I'm convinced of that. But no matter why, they aren't doing autopsies. But just because they're not doing autopsies doesn't mean they don't care about the body. They do. And they realize that in a lot of ways, the body is kind of speaking for the dead. Let's listen to it by paying attention to the body.
Yes, and this is one of the parts I love best about the book is you're like, it's systematic, it's logical. They are recognizing that you could kill a body first, like kill a person, throw the body in a lake or something, and then it wouldn't have any water in the lungs, which means they understand how drowning works. And I actually thought that sitting on the body to expel the water is genius. I wouldn't have thought of that, but it is probably a really effective way, as effective as these things get, to figure this out because you do need to know
Mhm.
what happened. Is it accidental? Is it not accidental? Because there were a lot of drownings at this time. And you want to find out, is it accidental or is it murder? Because that's a big difference.
Well, it really is. And I mean, this is the thing. It is interesting. There were a lot of drownings. I'm always shocked when going through the coroner's rolls. I'm left wondering, did nobody teach these people to swim? It's astounding how many times somebody heads off to take a bath and never comes back.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, this is the thing. When confronted with a lot of drowning deaths, it would be very easy to just sit back and say, oh, another person should have learned to swim but didn't. But they aren't. They are being careful with all of this to try and figure out what happened. So, I mean, that is something, again, it impresses me. I think a lot of people tend to think that the medieval legal system, the law enforcement system in particular, was very inefficient and corrupt, and they weren't really worried about catching anyone. I really don't think that's the case. It does seem to me that they were determined to resolve these matters whenever they could, because it's about restoring peace and harmony to a community. And that's not going to happen if everybody is worried that there's a murderer in the midst who should be punished.
Yes. And again, when it comes to what's happening to somebody, like say they catch a murderer, they may not always make sure that they're strung up. They may expel them from the community. And that's because the priorities are different. If they're not in the community anymore, then they're not a danger to the community. It's fine. It's done. And so we have to pay attention to these cultural differences.
Yeah, this is another one of the elements that I do end up talking a bit about in the book, but I've written about it elsewhere too. Again, a lot of people are very scornful, I think, about the medieval law enforcement system because there are very high rates of acquittal. It is true. Most people are acquitted. And you know what? A lot of those people probably did it.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that is very different between then and now is they didn't have gradations in punishment. I mean, the only punishment that existed for a felony was execution. But there are a lot of times where people can sit back and say, yeah, I know so and so killed so and so, but I'm not really sure he deserves to die for it. The other part is, I think that often people were sitting there and saying, basically, time served. This guy sat in prison for 4 years waiting for his trial. It was miserable. And prison back then really was much more miserable than it is today. Today,
Mm-hmm.
we feed you, we give you a place to sleep, we give you electricity and lighting. In this period, if you wanted any of that, you had to pay for it. And they were willing to go through the goods that they had confiscated from you to extract the money. So, if you were particularly cheap, you might just say, I'll forgo the hay. I don't need a candle. And then hope that your family might come in to feed you every now and then. But
Mm-hmm.
it could be pretty dire. And, if you sat in prison for 4 years, a lot of times I think people get out and say, yeah, that was punishment enough. I'm not sure that we actually need to convict in order to punish. So I think
Yes.
that's something that's really important. People are using the legal system in ways that it was not designed, but that's not a sign of failure. It's a sign of adaptation.
100%. And this is something that I harp on quite a lot when I'm talking to people about this is that there is a difference between law and justice. And when we are talking about a village where you know the people, you've known them your whole life, you know the circumstances, and this is the very reason why the juries worked as they did, like witnesses and things, it's different. It's different. And you can see in your book, you have a few examples of people sort of just tweaking the law a little bit so that justice is served rather than just the letter of the law.
Exactly. And, I mean, I think today as well, people would say there's a big difference between law and justice. But we often assume it's because, things have progressed so much that the legal system has gone crazy. It's gone so far away from its original goal. Our thinking is not actually that different from their thinking in the Middle Ages. I mean, I love anything they have to say about lawyers. They have the most terrible poems about lawyers in this period. They are saying they're corrupt. All they want is money. They also are constantly worried about judges out there. And, maybe they're making these decisions for their own good rather than, because it's the right thing to do. So I think it's important to recognize a lot of what it comes down to is lawmakers have very different values than the people who use the legal system.
Yes. And I mean, we do see this today with juries deciding to go their own way no matter what they're supposed to be doing. And I think this just sort of speaks to that human experience where we want justice, even if it doesn't quite fit the parameters that we're supposed to be following. And one of the examples that you give in the book is when it comes to suicide. So the coroner shows up, finds a body, and realizes, oh no, this person has killed themselves.
Mhm.
What are some of the things that might happen in that circumstance?
Yeah. So I will say suicide is a really difficult situation in this period. I actually suspect that often the community or maybe the family tried their best to sort of hide the possibility that it might have been suicide
Hmm.
before a coroner got there. It's actually astounding. There are quite a few instances where bodies are actually buried when the coroner shows up and he's like, what's going on here? So the coroner can demand that it be dug up so he can do an inquest. One could also expect that it might be a little bit harder at that point in time to figure out what killed the person.
Hmm.
But no matter what, I think that there is some concealment that happens at times. Granted, at other times, possibly not. They did worry that a person who died before their time was up could be one of those people who is going to be coming back as a revenant, a wanderer. So you have to be really careful about that because if that person does come back, then they could come back to take revenge on their community. So we also have the popular tradition of burying suicides at crossroads and hoping that if they do pop back up, they'll wander in the wrong direction and get somebody else's village. So, I mean, there's a lot of popular ideology going on about this, but I do think that there are attempts by juries at times to also talk about things like, well, maybe this is one of those suicides that is excusable. If a person was thought to be mentally unstable or not in their right mind, then that's one of those situations where you can sit back and say, yes, it was a suicide, but it's not the damning kind of suicide. So I
Hmm.
think again, there's a lot at play here to sort of either soften or harden the verdict if they want to.
Well, I think that it's an essential part of the whole process where people are discussing what are the motives, because if someone can't make a decision for themselves for whatever reason, and often they will say this person was just so sad they couldn't have done anything else. And so how can we condemn them? And so thinking about this in sort of a community situation, it makes complete sense, even if it looks very different from here.
Yeah. Well, and it does. And I mean, I have to say, today we do take a very different position, but at the same time, I mean, I live here in the US, and there are some states in the US where suicide is still considered to be a felony. So we're not that far off, even if it's an older law that's just still on the books that people wouldn't actually impose. I think it is important to recognize it's not that long ago that people were still sitting there and thinking that anybody who killed themselves was a felon, i.e., an absolutely horrific person who should be cast out from society.
Hmm.
I do think today we are inclined to think that there probably is some sort of mental illness, and that's why a person committed suicide.
Hmm.
Which again is interesting in itself. It tells you we are very much in denial of the possibility that a person could very rationally minded sit back and think, I just don't want to be part of this anymore. I'm now exiting.
Hmm.
We have trouble accepting that. Whereas in the Middle Ages, they clearly sat back and thought there's some people who are doing this rationally. Those people should be punished. There are other people who are not doing this rationally. It was a bad idea. And it was one that was made when they were really should not be held responsible for their actions. So it's a really different world. But I think that a lot of this sort of goes in trends in our society. And we are at a point where we don't like to hold people responsible. There is lots to think about on the subject. And clearly, the medieval world was of a very different mindset than we are in some respects, but not in all.
Yes, exactly. And one of the ways I thought was really interesting was you had a case of a person who was elderly and they died, and the verdict was poverty and old age. And that is something that we don't really like to look at in today's society either, the systemic problems, whereas the medieval world, they're like, this is what happened. So let's just roll with that.
Exactly. And again, it's sort of interesting then to think what role do those records actually play? I mean, is it useful in some ways for that information to make it back to the king? Oh, your subjects are dying from poverty and old age. Maybe
Yeah.
that is a good thing for him to hear and for him to encourage, for example, more monasteries to open their doors to the elderly, no matter how poor they were. And in the medieval period, if you wanted sort of like a retirement plan, you could give everything you own to a monastery and say, hey, look after me for the rest of my life. But again, you had to have money to do that. What happens when you're old? You don't have the money for that, and you don't have any kids. The odds are pretty good that poverty is what's going to kill you.
Yes. And again, this is the community looking straight at this. So it's worth asking the question. We're talking about responsibility. We're talking about systemic issues. Who decides whether the person had a motive or not? Who is the person that decides whether somebody is mentally competent to stand trial or not? Whose job is that?
It couldn't possibly have been the coroner. And I mean, again, the coroner is the one who's going to have this attributed to him because it's in his records, it's his inquest that found it, but he's from outside the community. He's not going to know. It's going to be the jury, and the jury is representing the community. I know it seems wrong to say that this is a community decision because that's a really big grouping we're putting out there. But the coroner's inquest is representing that community, and it's going to have to be a group decision. One of the things that I do argue in the book is I think that often that time before the coroner showed up was a really critical time. And particularly for some of these situations, I think that that's when they made up their minds what they were going to say and got everybody on board. That is the hard part with a community decision. You all have to sort of be on the same page, or at the very least the inquest jury does. So I think using that time before the coroner showed up to talk some of this through, it was probably a very critical moment.
Well, and it might seem from the outside like this is people getting their story straight and that this is perhaps people who are misrepresenting the truth, not telling the whole truth. But when we think about it, when a jury is sequestered, they are still making a decision about what happened, and they're doing it together. So it's not all that far off.
It really isn't. And actually, in some ways, this medieval situation was probably better because one of the problems with being sequestered is when you're sitting there thinking, oh, wait, I don't remember exactly what happened there. You have to go and ask for some sort of record and read it. Whereas in this situation, they can stop and say, hey, Jane, do you remember what happened here? Everybody else in the community is around and accessible. So I think it's much easier for them to make the decision because all the evidence that they have is there at their fingertips.
Right. And it's not as if they're not going to have Bill who's saying something different, and they'll have to weigh both of those opinions together. So there is dissent and there is discussion. And so, justice may actually be served in the end, whether it looks like ours or not.
Well, and on top of that, I think we always have to ask what we're talking about when we say the word justice. And this is, what are we looking for from the law enforcement system? Are we looking for punishment? Or are we looking to get back to normal? Are we looking to restore the peace that was in a community? Are we looking to make sure that there's nobody who is angry at anybody else, that everybody's just kind of happy that the right solution has been found? And I think that's critical because if we're totally thinking the legal system should be punitive, well then, okay, we're probably going to be unhappy with the medieval system often. But if we are looking at it's about reconciliation between unhappy parties, it's about restoring the peace. Well, I think they actually did a very good job.
Yeah, I would agree with you. And I think that if you stranded a whole bunch of people on a desert island, their
Mhm.
idea of justice would not look like it does in the city that they're currently from, for example. Now, there is one thing that I forgot to ask earlier. So this is coming sort of out of left field, but I think it's really important. And one of the people who was consulted sometimes for their own witness testimony is the priest. And that is, again, something that is unexpected today. Now, the priest knows everybody's business.
Yep.
Are they allowed to talk about it?
It's
Well,
a really difficult situation there. Yeah, probably not, but we know they often did. I mean, one of the biggest complaints people had about their priests at visitations is that, they were constantly going to the ale house and telling everybody what so and so said in confession. So we know that the seal of confession was just not respected in the way that it is today. I mean, how many times have we seen the movie where, the plot line is the priest knows exactly what happened, but he can't say a word?
mhm.
I don't really think that dilemma existed in the same way in the period. And the joy is Catholicism is a religion of forgiveness. You get forgiven over and over and over again. So if he does break the seal, oh, well, he's going to be forgiven anyways. It seems pretty clear that priests did play a role in all of this. I know we often are thinking, priests couldn't be jurors. They seem to have shown up on a lot of jury lists. And actually, since writing that book, I found more and more and more priests sitting on juries. I think that people liked having priests there because, first of all, they knew everyone in the community. They knew what was going on. They know the seedy side. They know all the people that you might have to worry about. Oh, so and so, he's a good suspect. Have you thought of talking to him? I mean, I can see a lot of situations like that. They're also often literate, which means if any written documents, for example, need to be checked, they're the perfect guys to send to, the guild house and say, hey, let's look at the last, records we had of who had a fight with whom and how that may actually have been something that precipitated this homicide. So I think that there's a good reason to make sure that the local parish priest was involved whenever you could.
Yeah, I'm just kind of imagining him being like, well, I can't really tell you, but if you guess, then then it's not a problem for me, and justice will be served in the end.
Exactly. Well, that's the thing. I mean, they live in those communities. It does really make a difference. They know who's going to be a problem. I mean, especially like who's more attentive to the disciplinary issues of a community? Nobody. The priest
Mhm.
is the guy who's in charge. He knows what's going on from confession. He knows who's most likely to be harboring bad feelings against someone. So, I mean, all of this makes them the ideal person to get involved, not necessarily sitting on the jury at all times, but at the very least, they got to show up to that inquest. They're going to be asked some questions.
Well, and in a time when you don't have church and state separated, a priest is a good person to have there as well, because if you're trying to make a decision about what your ruling is going to be, you need to ask the priest what the fallout is. And I think this is a really important part of medieval justice. If I say this is suicide, what's going to happen to that person's spirit? If I say this is murder, what's going to happen to mine if I'm wrong? So I think that the priest is an important person to have around in this kind of inquest.
Mm-hmm. No, and I think all of that is really critical. And one of those decisions as well that we're talking about here is I do think that both jurors and judges were not super keen to convict in part because they worried that in sentencing someone to be executed that they were committing murder. So if they were going to be involved in anything like that, I think that they wanted to make sure that the person who was going to be executed, quite frankly, as somebody who really, really deserved it. They were somebody who was repeatedly committing criminal acts and could not be trusted to reform themselves. They'd already been given a second, maybe even a third chance. At this point, there's nothing else that could be done. That's where you reserve execution. And, in those situations, you hope that God would agree with you.
Well, I think that is so true because whenever I'm pushing back against the idea that people are just getting executed left and right, you're saying they're not mostly getting executed. And I think it's because people are concerned with their immortal souls because it is a big decision to take someone's life. And of course, they're going to be hesitant to do that, which is another reason why they would be so concerned with forensics in the first place.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah, we're vibing again. And I could talk with you about this forever. And the book is truly excellent for people who are interested not only in medieval thinking through things like justice, but also how the law in England works. And so even though this isn't your most recent book, I do hope people will pick it up and read it. Thank you so much for being on here. This has just been so much fun. We should totally do it again sometime.
I completely agree. And let me say, I absolutely love your podcast. I listen to it frequently. And honestly, it's a great way I find to introduce me to people whose work I haven't read, but really should.
Well, that's perfect because other people can now be introduced to your work and it all goes around. I do love this medieval community. Thanks, Sara, so much for being here.
You're welcome.
To find out more about Sara's work, you can visit her faculty page at Ohio State University. The book we discussed today is Forensic Medicine and Death Investigation in Medieval England. Before we go, here's Peter from medievalist.net to tell us what's on the website. What's going on, Peter?
Hey. So we're taking a look this week at the Inquisition, and we found out that they're not so good.
Well, yes, I think they're probably not so good. Yes, I think we could agree on that.
But it's good as ineffective, right?
Okay.
So we had this trio of scholars. They wrote out to me and asked, hey, we want to put an article on medievalist.net, talk about our research. And I'm going to give you their names, give a shout out to them. Jose Luis Esteves, Davor Salavovich, and Stoyan Skorov, who did this research looking at an Italian village called Gianvo. And there was an inquisition held there in 1335.
Mm-hmm.
They were going after the Waldensians. Bad group, right? Bad group of heretics.
I guess if you're a part of the Inquisition, you might think so. Okay.
So the bishop, the local lord, they did everything. Asked, did the tortures, stuff like that. But when they looked at the outcomes of it, they found that they rapidly got diminishing results, even as they were torturing people, because they would only name off people that were already known suspects or individuals previously denounced or those who had fled the village long ago. So there was a lot of flaws in this Inquisition, just how they go about doing their jobs. They weren't very good at it, and they were especially poor at interviewing women. So it was very fascinating and says, a lot of why these so-called heretics and heresy continued on in places in Europe for like centuries.
Yeah. I mean, if people are going to believe stuff, it's going to be very hard to get them to not believe that anymore, even under threat, even under torture.
Yeah, you play the Inquisition right. So we have that piece, plus a new episode of Bow and Blade is now out. Michael and Kelly took the summer off, and they've come back, and they're basically just talking about what they did over the summer.
I love that, because they usually do interesting stuff over the summer.
Indeed. There's a lot of castle hopping in Europe.
Mm-hmm.
So we have that, plus Sonia Maurer-Daus looks at lullabies and music for children in the Middle Ages. And Ayush Lazikani looks at two moon goddesses and how they got depicted in medieval times.
Wonderful. Well, thanks, Peter, for stopping by and telling us what's on the website.
Thanks.
Thank you, as always, to all of you for supporting my work by listening, sharing, letting the ads play through, or becoming patrons on patreon.com. Patrons are my heroes because without you, none of this would be possible. So thank you. To find out more or to become a patron, please visit patreon.com/medievalists. For everything from murder to Mordor, follow medievalist.net on Instagram at medievalistnet or Blue Sky at medievalists. You can find me, Danièle Cybulskie, across social media at 5MIN Medievalist or 5 Minute Medievalist. And you can find my books at all your favorite bookstores. Our music is by Christian Overton. Thanks for listening, and have yourself an amazing day.